The Americans used shells without thinking while we counted every round. Captain Tameichi Hara, one of Japan's most decorated destroyer commanders, spoke these words with a mixture of awe and resignation. He had survived more naval battles than almost any other Japanese officer, from the opening salvos at Guadalcanal to the desperate final actions off Okinawa. What haunted him most wasn't American tactics or technology. It was something far more fundamental and overwhelming: the sheer, incomprehensible volume of ammunition the United States could throw into battle. This wasn't hyperbole. It was mathematical reality. By 1944, the United States was producing more ammunition in a single month than Japan could manufacture in an entire year. This disparity, so vast it seemed impossible to officers on both sides, would ultimately decide the fate of the Pacific War more decisively than any tactical brilliance or strategic maneuver. While American gunners could fire at will, creating what Japanese sailors called walls of fire, their counterparts across the Pacific were melting down temple bells to make brass casings and rationing shells like gold. This is the story of how the war was truly won. Not just on the decks of carriers or the beaches of contested islands, but in the sprawling ammunition plants of Nebraska, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, where millions of American workers, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before Pearl Harbor, turned out an endless river of steel and explosives that would literally bury Japan's carefully husbanded reserves beneath an avalanche of American industrial might. The contrast became apparent from the very first major naval engagement. On the night of November 12 to 13, 1942, off Guadalcanal, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan led a force of American cruisers and destroyers into a chaotic nighttime brawl with a Japanese bombardment force. The engagement descended into a point-blank slugfest in the darkness, ships passing within yards of each other, muzzle flashes illuminating twisted steel and churning water. The USS San Francisco alone fired over 1,100 5-inch shells in less than 30 minutes, more ammunition than some Japanese destroyers carried in their entire magazines for both main guns and secondaries combined. The USS Atlanta exhausted its entire ready ammunition supply and was frantically bringing up shells from below decks, passing them in human chains as loaders worked in smoke-filled turrets. When American ships withdrew from that engagement, their concern wasn't whether they'd survive, many wouldn't, but whether they'd run completely dry before dawn. The Japanese, by contrast, had fought with exquisite care, each salvo calculated, each shell precious. They had won a tactical victory that night, sinking several American ships and completing their bombardment mission, but they retreated knowing they'd expended ammunition they couldn't easily replace. The Americans, for their part, limped back to whatever passed for a harbor, requested resupply, and within days had replacement ammunition steaming toward them from depots in New Caledonia, ultimately sourced from production lines that had barely noticed the expenditure. This pattern would repeat itself across hundreds of engagements, from the confined waters of Iron Bottom Sound near Guadalcanal to the vast expanses of the Philippine Sea. American doctrine evolved to emphasize suppressive fire, saturation bombardment, and the simple overwhelming of enemy positions through sheer volume. Pre-invasion bombardments that began as careful, aimed shoots evolved into multi-day affairs where battleships would fire thousands of rounds at targets that earlier planners would have allocated dozens of shells to engage. The bombardment of Iwo Jima saw American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fire over 22,000 shells at an island just 8 square miles in size over 3 days before the landings. Officers noted targets in their action reports with clinical precision. Pillbox destroyed after 47 rounds of 5-inch, concrete bunker neutralized with 23 rounds of 8-inch, noting expenditures that would have horrified their counterparts in any other navy. Aerial spotters directed fire with an almost casual profligacy. Walk your fire up that ridgeline, saturate the area. Ships would respond by firing not 1 or 2 ranging shots, but dozens, then scores, then hundreds of shells, until the target area was simply erased beneath high explosive and flying coral. Japanese naval doctrine, in stark contrast, emphasized precision, conservation, and the devastating effectiveness of individual well-placed shots. Japanese gunners were among the best trained in the world, spending countless hours in practice, learning to gauge range by eye and intuition, to fire accurately from unstable platforms in heavy seas, to make every shell count. Their optical equipment was excellent, their rangefinders sophisticated, their fire control procedures refined through endless drills. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Japanese cruisers demonstrated this precision, scoring hits at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards in poor visibility. Each salvo carefully plotted, corrections meticulously calculated. But this excellence was born of necessity as much as tradition. Every shell had to count because there simply weren't enough shells to waste. Japanese supply officers calculated ammunition loads not by what a ship could carry, but by what could be spared from reserve stocks that were already insufficient before the first shot of the war was fired. A Japanese destroyer might sortie with perhaps 60 to 80 rounds per gun, enough for a single major engagement if carefully managed. An American destroyer of similar size might carry 3 to 4 times that amount and could expect resupply within days of any major action. The philosophical difference went deeper than mere supply. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built around the concept of the decisive battle, a single, climactic engagement where superior training, spirit, and tactical excellence would overcome any material disadvantage. This was the legacy of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in 1905 through superior gunnery, maneuver, and morale. Japanese officers studied that battle religiously, seeing in it proof that a smaller, more efficient force could defeat a larger, more materially wealthy enemy through spiritual superiority and technical excellence. Ammunition was to be husbanded for that climactic moment, expended in careful, devastating salvos that would cripple enemy flagships, shatter enemy morale, and decide the war in an afternoon. The problem was that the Americans refused to fight that way. They wouldn't obligingly sail their battle line into a single decisive engagement where Japanese gunnery excellence could tell. Instead, they fought dozens, then hundreds of smaller actions, each one bleeding away Japan's carefully hoarded ammunition reserves, each one demonstrating that material abundance could simply overwhelm qualitative superiority through sheer, grinding, relentless attrition. American naval officers, particularly the younger generation who rose to prominence during the war, understood this dynamic instinctively. They had grown up in an industrial society where abundance was normal, where production could always be increased, where running out of anything was a temporary logistical problem rather than an existential threat. Admiral Raymond Spruance, known for his cautious tactical approach, nonetheless encouraged his ships to fire freely when targets presented themselves. Admiral William "Bull" Halsey was even more aggressive, telling his commanders to shoot first and ask questions later. Confident that ammunition expended would be ammunition replaced, the Atlantic Fleet's experiences fighting U-boats had already demonstrated the effectiveness of saturation tactics, dropping dozens of depth charges in carefully plotted patterns rather than trying to pinpoint individual submarines with single, perfectly placed explosions. This same philosophy translated to surface combat. Why risk a perfect shot that might miss when you could fire 10 shots or 20 or 100 and guarantee hits through sheer volume? The disparity was perhaps most visible in anti-aircraft fire. American ships developed a defensive doctrine built entirely around creating walls of steel in the sky, volumes of space so filled with exploding shells and flying shrapnel that enemy aircraft couldn't physically pass through without being hit. The proximity fuse, introduced in 1943, made this even more effective, allowing shells to explode near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits, turning every 5-inch gun into an area denial weapon. By 1944, an American task force under air attack would light up the sky with thousands of rounds per minute, the combined fire of dozens of ships creating a visible dome of explosions and tracer fire. Japanese pilots compared it to flying into a thunderstorm made of steel. The American ships didn't aim carefully at individual aircraft. They couldn't, the attacks came too fast and from too many directions. Instead, they created zones of destruction, firing into the path of oncoming planes, calculating fields of fire where overlapping patterns of explosions made survival mathematically improbable. It was profligate, wasteful by any traditional naval standard, and absolutely devastating in its effectiveness. Japanese ships, by contrast, had to be far more selective. Their anti-aircraft ammunition stocks were limited, their resupply uncertain. Gunners were trained to pick individual targets, track them carefully, fire controlled bursts at the most vulnerable moment. This worked well enough in early engagements when American air attacks were smaller and less coordinated. But as the war progressed and American carrier task forces began launching strikes of hundreds of aircraft, Japanese ships found themselves overwhelmed. Their gunners would fire carefully aimed bursts at the first wave of attackers, might score kills against a few planes, but then the second wave would come in, and the third and the fourth, and ammunition reserves would dwindle as the attacks continued. By 1944, Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine had shifted to emphasizing evasive maneuvering over gunnery. Not because Japanese gunners had become less skilled, but because they simply didn't have enough shells to create the kind of defensive fire that might actually stop a massed American airstrike. The ammunition that American ships fired so freely had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was a constellation of massive industrial plants scattered across the American heartland, far from any ocean, built and operated at a scale that would have seemed fantastical before the war. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Independence, Missouri, covered nearly 4,000 acres by 1943, employed over 20,000 workers at peak production, and produced small arms ammunition, rifle and machine gun rounds, at a rate of over 10 million rounds per day. 10 million rounds per day. That single plant produced more small arms ammunition in a month than the entire Japanese ammunition industry produced in a year. And it was just one of dozens of similar facilities scattered from coast to coast. The naval ammunition plants told an even more staggering story. The Naval Ammunition Depot at Hastings, Nebraska, about as far from saltwater as you could get in North America, was built starting in 1942 on what had been farmland and prairie. By 1943, it covered over 49,000 acres, had 2,400 buildings connected by 150 miles of roads and 50 miles of railroad track, and employed 6,500 workers who loaded, assembled, and shipped naval shells around the clock. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Buildings the size of aircraft hangars were filled floor to ceiling with shells in various stages of assembly. Explosive compounds arrived by the trainload TNT, ammonium picrate, composition B, synthesized at dedicated chemical plants built for war production. Brass casings came from mills that had been making plumbing fixtures and doorknobs before Pearl Harbor. Fuses, primers, propellant bags, packing materials, all of it converged at these massive assembly plants where it was transformed into the finished product. Artillery shells ready to fire. The women who worked in these plants became the invisible army that won the Pacific War. Before 1942, most had never worked outside the home or had held traditional women's jobs, teaching, nursing, clerical work. Now they operated hydraulic presses that seeded primers into shell bases with multi-ton force. They filled shells with molten explosive, monitoring temperatures to within a few degrees, knowing that a mistake could mean a catastrophic detonation that would kill everyone in the building and possibly several buildings nearby. They assembled fuses with tweezers and magnifying glasses, working with components so sensitive that static electricity could cause an explosion. They inspected finished shells, rejecting any with the slightest defect, maintaining quality control standards that kept ammunition reliability above 98% throughout the war. They worked 8-hour shifts, sometimes 10 or 12 when production quotas demanded it, came home exhausted, slept, and returned to do it again. Their work was classified. They couldn't talk about what they did, where they worked, or how much they produced. But they knew, in a vague way, that every shell they assembled might save an American life somewhere across the Pacific, might destroy an enemy gun that would otherwise kill American soldiers, might be the one that made the difference in some distant, desperate battle. The logistics of moving this ammunition from Nebraska and Missouri and Pennsylvania to forward areas in the Pacific was itself an epic undertaking. Shells were packed in wooden crates, loaded onto rail cars, shipped to West Coast ports, San Francisco, San Diego, Long Beach, where they were transferred to ammunition ships, special-built vessels, or converted cargo ships with holds designed to safely carry explosives. These ammunition ships were floating bombs, everyone knew it, and they were treated with appropriate respect. No smoking anywhere aboard, special protocols for loading and unloading, careful attention to temperature and humidity to prevent accidental detonation. They sailed in convoys across the Pacific, sometimes taking weeks to reach forward bases at Ulithi, Manus, or Eniwetok. There, the shells would be transferred again, to smaller cargo vessels or directly to warships that pulled alongside to replenish their magazines. The entire system, production, transportation, storage, distribution, had to work flawlessly to keep the fleet supplied. And remarkably, it did. Ships that expended thousands of rounds in a single day's bombardment could expect resupply within a week, sometimes less if the tactical situation demanded it. The ammunition pipeline never ran dry. Japan had nothing remotely comparable. Japanese ammunition production was centralized at a handful of plants, most of them concentrated in the home islands and all of them vulnerable to bombing once the war turned against Japan. The Kokura Arsenal, one of Japan's largest military production facilities, could produce perhaps 5,000 large-caliber naval shells per month at peak capacity. The entire Japanese ammunition industry, working at full capacity with no regard for worker safety or equipment maintenance, might match the output of 2 or 3 of America's major plants. And Japan was fighting across an empire that stretched from Burma to the Central Pacific, trying to supply garrisons on hundreds of scattered islands, each one needing ammunition for its defenders, all of it having to be shipped through waters increasingly controlled by American submarines and aircraft. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. Even if Japan could have matched American production shell for shell, and it couldn't, not remotely, it couldn't ship that ammunition to where it was needed. American submarines made resupply runs to forward bases a lethal gamble. By late 1943, more ammunition was being sent to the bottom of the Pacific on torpedoed freighters than was reaching frontline units. The material composition of ammunition itself revealed the disparity. American shells were made from high-quality steel, precisely machined, filled with sophisticated explosive compounds that had been tested and refined for maximum effectiveness. Brass casings were uniform, made from consistent alloys, with precise dimensional tolerances that ensured reliable feeding and extraction in automatic weapons. Propellants were carefully formulated mixtures that burned at consistent rates, giving predictable ballistics and minimal barrel wear. Everything was standardized. A 5-inch/38 shell made in Nebraska would fit and function perfectly in a gun on a ship built in Philadelphia or San Francisco, would have identical ballistic characteristics to shells made 6 months earlier or later. This interchangeability was the foundation of American logistical efficiency. Japanese ammunition, particularly late in the war, showed increasingly desperate improvisation. Steel quality declined as high-grade ores became unavailable, replaced by whatever could be obtained from occupied territories or salvaged from civilian sources. Shell walls were made thinner to conserve metal, reducing effectiveness and occasionally causing premature detonations in gun barrels. Explosive fillers became less powerful as chemical precursors became scarce. Japan never developed the large-scale synthetic explosive industry that supplied American arsenals. Most notoriously, brass became so scarce that Japan launched systematic campaigns to collect anything made of copper alloys. Temple bells, decorative fittings, household items, anything that could be melted down and recast into shell casings. Buddhist temples across Japan had their ancient bronze bells removed and sent to foundries. Centuries-old artifacts transformed into a few dozen shell casings in a desperate attempt to keep guns supplied. Even then, there wasn't enough. By 1945, some Japanese ammunition was being manufactured with steel cartridge cases, which worked poorly, caused extraction problems, and accelerated weapon wear, but at least allowed guns to keep firing. The quality control problems extended to everything. American proximity fuses were marvels of miniaturized electronics, radio transmitters the size of a thumb that could detect an aircraft and detonate the shell at optimal range. Japanese attempts to copy this technology failed. They lacked the precision manufacturing capabilities and the advanced electronic components. Japanese fuses remained mechanical, requiring either direct impact or timed detonation, both far less effective against maneuvering aircraft. Even basic components showed the strain. American primers were uniform and reliable, almost never failing to ignite. Japanese primers became increasingly unreliable as material quality declined. Duds became common enough that gunnery officers had to factor in failure rates when calculating ammunition requirements. Propellants deteriorated in storage, particularly in tropical climates, losing power and consistency, making gunnery calculations problematic. A gun might be cited for shells made in 1942, but firing ammunition manufactured in 1944 with different propellant characteristics, different shell weights, different tolerances, all of which meant missed shots and wasted ammunition. Japanese logistical systems desperation became most visible in the Tokyo Express runs, high-speed destroyer operations that attempted to resupply forward garrisons under cover of darkness. These runs, called rat runs by Americans, were tactical innovations born of dire necessity. Unable to safely operate slow cargo ships during daylight when American aircraft dominated the skies, the Japanese Navy converted their fastest destroyers into makeshift transports. Ammunition, food, and reinforcements would be loaded onto destroyers at Rabaul or other rear area bases. The ships would race south at 30 knots or faster, timing their arrival at Guadalcanal or other forward positions for the darkest hours of night. They'd heave supplies overboard in sealed drums, hoping shore parties could recover them, or occasionally make brief, hurried stops to offload cargo directly before racing back north to reach air cover before dawn. These operations were dangerous and inefficient. Destroyers weren't cargo ships. Their holds were small, their loading equipment minimal. A destroyer that might carry 8 tons of ammunition on a Tokyo Express run could have carried perhaps 100 tons if it could have been transported on a proper cargo vessel. But cargo vessels couldn't survive in contested waters, so destroyers ran the supplies, trip after trip, burning fuel oil that was itself desperately scarce, risking valuable warships and trained crews to deliver a trickle of supplies when what was needed was a flood. Many didn't make it back. American aircraft caught them at dawn. American destroyers and cruisers intercepted them during the runs. American submarines waited along their routes. The Tokyo Express bled the Japanese Navy of destroyers. Ships that had been built for fleet actions were being used as glorified cargo vessels and getting sunk for the effort. The desperation extended to battlefield improvisation that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Japanese forces on isolated islands, their ammunition stockpiles exhausted by American bombardments and impossible to resupply, began manufacturing their own in crude field workshops. On Peleliu, American forces discovered Japanese positions where soldiers had been filling empty shells with whatever explosives they could improvise: picric acid scraped from unexploded naval shells, TNT from disassembled landmines, even improvised explosives made from fertilizer and fuel oil. The quality was abysmal, reliability nearly zero, but desperate men with empty guns had no other choice. Similar improvisations were found across the Pacific: handmade grenades fashioned from tin cans, rifle ammunition reloaded multiple times until the brass cartridges split, artillery shells filled with chunks of coral and scrap metal when proper shrapnel wasn't available. The aerial war showed the same pattern. Japanese aircraft flew with minimal ammunition loads, pilots instructed to conserve their fire, take careful shots, return with unused ammunition if they didn't encounter definite targets. This was possible early in the war when Japanese pilot quality was high and aerial combat was relatively infrequent. But as pilot losses mounted and training time declined, itself a function of fuel shortages that made extensive flight training impossible, the requirement to conserve ammunition became a death sentence. Green Japanese pilots in 1944 would encounter American formations, try to line up careful shots, be killed before they could fire effectively, all because doctrine demanded ammunition conservation that was impossible in the reality of aerial combat. American pilots, by contrast, were taught to fire freely. Their aircraft carried large ammunition loads. They could expend hundreds of rounds in a single engagement, spray fire into enemy formations, hose off bursts at any target that presented itself. They were explicitly told that ammunition was cheap, aircraft and pilots were valuable, and bringing home unused ammunition was nothing to be proud of. This profligacy allowed aggressive tactics, rapid engagement and disengagement, fire without perfect position, all of which gave American pilots decisive advantages even before considering aircraft performance differences. The submarine campaign illustrated the logistical catastrophe in miniature. American submarines patrolling Japanese supply routes carried approximately 24 torpedoes, enough for multiple patrols, with submarines regularly expending their entire load and returning to Pearl Harbor or Fremantle for reload before heading out again. The resupply infrastructure was robust enough that submarines could expect immediate reload upon arrival, could be back on station within a week of making port. Japanese submarines, by contrast, often sortied with reduced torpedo loads, conserving their stocks for the highest value targets, instructed to avoid merchant shipping and focus on warships, a doctrine that wasted their potential while American submarines were strangling Japanese commerce. When Japanese submarines did attack, they often had to return to base with torpedoes remaining, unable to continue patrol because fuel rather than weapons was the limiting factor. And resupply, when it came, was uncertain. Torpedoes were complex weapons requiring precision manufacturing. Japan's production capacity was limited. Priority went to surface ships and aircraft. Submarines were a secondary concern. By 1944, Japanese submarines were operating with whatever torpedoes could be spared, sometimes using obsolete or defective weapons, sometimes unable to sortie at all for lack of ammunition. The battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, showcased the ammunition disparity in its most dramatic form. A force of Japanese battleships and cruisers, the center force under Admiral Kurita, including the massive battleship Yamato, unexpectedly encountered Taffy 3, a group of 6 small American escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. On paper, it was a massacre waiting to happen. The Japanese ships outgunned, out-armored, and outweighed the Americans by an absurd margin. Yamato alone displaced more than all of Taffy 3's ships combined and carried guns that could obliterate any American vessel with a single hit. Sprague's only advantages were aircraft. The escort carrier's planes could attack the Japanese ships, and sheer desperation-fueled aggression. His destroyers and destroyer escorts charged directly at the Japanese battle line, firing torpedoes and guns in what should have been a suicidal sacrifice play to buy time for the carriers to escape. The destroyers USS Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts, along with destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, Raymond, and others, pressed their attacks with berserk courage, closing to point-blank range, firing continuously at Japanese battleships and cruisers. The Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, fired so many 5-inch shells that her crew later couldn't remember an accurate count. Estimates ranged from over 200 rounds per gun, essentially her entire ready ammunition supply and everything they could bring up from the magazines while under fire. She fired all 10 torpedoes, scored hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano, raked Japanese ships with 40mm and 20mm fire that couldn't possibly penetrate their armor but added to the confusion and distraction. The whole exhausted her ammunition similarly. Every torpedo, every 5-inch shell, firing continuously even as Japanese shells tore through her thin armor, killed her crew, knocked out turrets. The Samuel B. Roberts, a tiny destroyer escort never meant for fleet actions, engaged the heavy cruiser Chokai at ranges where the American 5-inch guns could actually be effective, firing over 600 rounds from her 2 main battery guns before they literally blew themselves apart from the volume and rapidity of fire, barrels warped from continuous shooting at maximum rate. This profligate expenditure of ammunition, which would have horrified Japanese supply officers, was possible because Sprague's ships knew, at some level, even in the chaos of battle, that ammunition was available, replenishment was possible if they survived. The limiting factor was time and survival, not shells. They fired everything they had because they could get more. The psychological freedom this provided can't be overstated. Gunnery officers didn't calculate remaining ammunition and ration shots accordingly. They fired as fast as guns could cycle, kept firing until magazines were empty or the ship was sinking, trusted that if they survived, more shells would be provided. This allowed a level of tactical aggression that was literally impossible for their opponents. The Japanese ships, by contrast, showed more restraint even in what should have been a target-rich environment. They were careful with their main battery ammunition, selecting targets deliberately, firing controlled salvos rather than rapid fire. Part of this was doctrine. Japanese gunnery emphasized precision over volume. But part was ingrained conservation born of years of supply constraints. Even here, with American carriers almost within range and destroyers pressing suicidal attacks, Japanese gunners fired carefully, selected targets, avoided wasteful expenditure. The Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, mounted 9 18-inch guns, weapons that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds to ranges exceeding 25 miles. Each shell cost approximately what a small car would have cost in pre-war Japan, required specialized handling, and was effectively irreplaceable. Yamato fired these sparingly at Samar, fewer than 100 rounds total, carefully aimed salvos at the escort carriers. This was actually reasonable fire control. Battleship ammunition was scarce and valuable. But it also meant that the concentration of fire on individual targets was lower than American doctrine would have called for, giving the carriers more time to evade, laying smoke, launching aircraft that further disrupted Japanese gunnery. The battle ended with 3 of Sprague's destroyers and destroyer escorts sunk, 1 escort carrier sunk, others damaged, but the Japanese retreating before they destroyed the entire force. Multiple factors contributed to Kurita's decision to withdraw. He was confused about what he was facing, concerned about aerial attacks, worried about American battleships that might be approaching. But ammunition was part of the calculation. His ships had expended significant portions of their magazines, not knowing when resupply would be possible, not knowing what other actions might be coming. The American philosophy of fighting freely, expending ammunition generously, didn't require that calculation. If Sprague's surviving ships had been forced into another action the next day, ammunition ships would have already been steaming toward them from Ulithi. The entire material apparatus of American logistics was behind them, invisible but decisive. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated the ammunition disparity in aerial combat. Japanese carrier aircraft launched mass strikes against Task Force 58, the American fast carrier force under Admiral Mark Mitcher. The result was systematic slaughter. American fighters intercepted the Japanese strikes far from the carriers, using radar direction to position themselves advantageously, then tearing into Japanese formations with overwhelming firepower. American F-6F Hellcats carried approximately 400 rounds per gun for their 6.50 caliber machine guns, 2,400 rounds total per aircraft. In the dense aerial combats of June 19th, pilots fired freely, bursts of 3 to 5 seconds, multiple passes on individual targets, engaging anything that looked like an enemy aircraft. Many returned with ammunition nearly exhausted, having fired 1,500 or 2,000 rounds in the course of multiple engagements. This level of expenditure was explicitly encouraged. Doctrine emphasized shooting enemy aircraft down over conserving ammunition, and the logistics existed to support that doctrine. Carriers restocked aircraft ammunition between strikes, armorers working frantically to reload fighters so they could launch again as additional Japanese attacks appeared. The Japanese pilots faced multiple disadvantages: inferior training, increasingly obsolescent aircraft, overwhelming numbers of American fighters. But ammunition limitations made everything worse. Japanese fighters carried smaller ammunition loads. Pilots were instructed to fire in short bursts, conserve their limited supply. This doctrine had worked earlier in the war when Japanese pilot quality was higher and combats were more likely to be 1-versus-1 engagements where brief, accurate bursts could be decisive. Against the massed formations of 1944, with multiple American fighters attacking from various angles, conservation was impossible. Japanese pilots who tried to carefully aim and fire short bursts were shot down before they could be effective. Those who fired more aggressively ran out of ammunition quickly, leaving them defenseless in an environment where American fighters were everywhere. The few Japanese aircraft that reached the American carriers faced walls of anti-aircraft fire so intense that survival was nearly impossible. American ships fired thousands of proximity-fused 5-inch shells, tens of thousands of 40mm rounds, hundreds of thousands of 20mm rounds, creating a curtain of steel that simply obliterated anything that tried to pass through it. The results were catastrophic for Japan. Approximately 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down on June 19th alone. 300 aircraft, their pilots, their crews, irreplaceable veterans and green recruits alike, all gone in a single day. American losses were fewer than 30 aircraft. The Turkey Shoot nickname was grimly appropriate. It was like shooting tethered birds, so one-sided that American pilots almost felt guilty, though not guilty enough to stop shooting. This wasn't just superior skill or better aircraft, though both mattered. It was the material reality of unlimited ammunition meeting desperate scarcity, abundance overwhelming conservation through sheer, relentless, grinding volume of fire. The final sortie of the battleship Yamato in April 1945 embodied the tragedy of Japan's ammunition situation. Yamato was assigned a suicide mission: sail to Okinawa, beach herself, and use her massive guns as stationary artillery to support the island's defenders. The operation was named Tengo, Heavenly Operation, because everyone knew it was suicide. Yamato sortied with a reduced ammunition load, approximately 60% of capacity, roughly 1,000 shells for her main battery, because that was all that could be spared and because the operation planners knew she wouldn't survive long enough to use more. She sailed without air cover. Japan no longer had carrier aircraft to spare, no fuel to operate them, no pilots with sufficient training to protect a surface force. The ship was magnificent, massive, the ultimate expression of battleship design, and she was sailing to her death because there was nothing else left to do with her. Fuel was too scarce to keep her in port consuming bunker oil for her steam plants. Ammunition was insufficient for sustained fleet action. The strategic situation had collapsed beyond any possibility of conventional victory. So she sailed to die. American submarines detected her almost immediately. Operation Tengo was compromised before it truly began. American aircraft found her on April 7th, hundreds of miles from Okinawa, still heading southwest. The strike groups were massive, nearly 400 aircraft from multiple carriers, bombers and torpedo planes and fighters, attacking in coordinated waves. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, her 25mm and 5-inch guns trying to create defensive fire, but they were completely overwhelmed. The volume of attacking aircraft was too great, coming from too many directions. The individual guns couldn't cover enough sky. American pilots pressed their attacks through the anti-aircraft fire, which killed several aircraft. But most got through because there simply wasn't enough defensive fire to stop them all. This was the arithmetic of ammunition scarcity meeting abundance. Yamato had thousands of anti-aircraft shells, but the attack involved thousands of aircraft sorties, and you can't stop thousands of sorties with thousands of shells when you need dozens of shells to have any real chance of downing each aircraft. The battleship died slowly, accumulating hits from torpedoes and bombs. Her armor resisted many of the weapons. She was built to withstand battleship shells, and aircraft weapons were individually less powerful. But the hits kept coming, wave after wave, torpedoes opening her hull to the sea, bombs penetrating decks, fires starting and spreading, internal systems failing. She capsized and exploded approximately 2 hours after the first attack, taking 2,500 of her crew with her, including Admiral Seiichi Ito, who commanded the operation. She sank with much of her main battery ammunition still aboard, massive 18-inch shells tumbling into the depths, unfired because she'd never gotten close enough to. August 1944. German generals are celebrating in their command bunkers. They're watching Allied tanks grind to a halt across France. Not from German bullets, but from something far simpler: they've run out of gas. Field Marshal von Rundstedt is smiling, telling his officers, "We don't need to defeat them. Physics will do it for us. They're 400 miles from their supply ports. Their offensive is dead." But then something happens that these brilliant military minds never anticipated. Something so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would become the logistical miracle of World War II. Convoy appears, but not just any convoy. 6,000 trucks, 23,000 men, operating 24 hours a day on a single highway, painted with red balls, driven mostly by African American soldiers who weren't even supposed to be in combat roles. And they're about to do the impossible. This is the story of how a supply operation became Hitler's worst nightmare, and why German generals would later admit, "We never calculated for this." Summer 1944. Operation Overlord has succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. After the D-Day landings in June, Allied forces have broken through German defenses at Normandy, and Patton's Third Army is racing across France at speeds that shock even the Germans. But there's a problem, a massive problem. The Allied war machine is devouring supplies at an insane rate. A single armored division needs 300,000 gallons of gasoline per day. Multiply that by dozens of divisions, add in ammunition, food, medical supplies, and spare parts, and you have a logistical nightmare. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group alone needs 20,000 tons of supplies every single day. In their command posts, German generals are actually relieved because they've studied Napoleon and understand the tyranny of distance. Major General Alfred Jodl writes in his diary, "The Allies have outrun their supply lines. They must stop. It's not opinion, it's mathematics." The math is brutally simple. Allied supplies land at Normandy beaches. Patton's tanks are now 400+ miles inland. Normal military supply doctrine says you can't sustain an army more than 100 miles from its base, and the French railway system is destroyed from Allied bombing. The Allies only have one viable route: a single highway, and everyone knows you can't supply an entire army group on one road. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the crisis is real. Patton is screaming into phones, My men can taste Germany, and you're telling me to stop because of gas? Eisenhower faces an impossible choice: halt the advance, giving Germans time to regroup and potentially prolonging the war by months, costing thousands of lives, or try something that has never been done in military history. August 25, 1944, a plan is born in desperation. They would create a dedicated highway, a Red Ball Express, named after railroad terminology for expedited freight. This 700-mile loop would be exclusively for supply trucks, no civilian traffic, no military traffic except supply vehicles, just truck after truck after truck. The numbers they're planning are insane. 6,000 trucks operating 24/7, one truck every 30 seconds, targeting 12,500 tons per day. To put this in perspective, this is like trying to move the entire cargo of 50 modern Boeing 747s every single day using 2.5-ton trucks on war-damaged roads. Here's where the story gets interesting. The majority of Red Ball drivers, about 75%, were African-American soldiers from quartermaster truck companies. In 1944 America, these men faced segregation at home, and the military didn't trust them with combat roles, relegating them to support positions like truck drivers, cooks, and laborers. But Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee saw what others didn't. These men were some of the most skilled drivers in the Army. Many had driven trucks in civilian life, they were mechanically inclined, and critically, they were motivated. Private William Scott from the 3,549th Quartermaster Truck Company recalled, "They told us straight. The Luftwaffe would strafe us, we'd be driving at night without headlights. The roads were cratered, trucks would break down in enemy territory, and some of us wouldn't make it back." Every man in the room raised his hand. The Red Ball Express operated under strict protocols that sound insane even today. Drivers worked in shifts of 24 to 36 hours straight. Trucks maintained speeds of 35 miles per hour regardless of conditions. No stopping except for breakdowns or ambush. Convoys ran with minimal lighting at night to avoid German aircraft, and checkpoints were established every 50 miles for fuel and maintenance. On August 25, 1944, the first convoy rolled out from St. Lo, and what happened next would be studied in military academies for decades. The trucks formed an unbroken chain stretching for hundreds of miles, and from the air, it looked like a giant red snake crawling across France because each truck was marked with a red ball on a white background for identification. The conditions were nightmarish. Roads designed for civilian traffic were now carrying military vehicles weighing several tons. August heat turned truck cabs into ovens reaching 120 degrees. Dust clouds from convoys reduced visibility to near zero, and German aircraft still controlled parts of the sky. Private First Class Leon Bass remembered, "You'd be driving and suddenly there's explosions ahead. You don't stop. You don't slow down. You swerve around the burning wreckage and keep going because 50 trucks are behind you and they're not stopping either." The drivers developed their own survival techniques. Sleeping while driving in short bursts, navigating by counting telephone poles when it was too dark to see, using hand signals because radio silence was mandatory, and forming brotherhoods within companies to watch each other's backs. September 1944, German intelligence officers are receiving reports that don't make sense. American tanks that should have been out of fuel for weeks are still advancing. Supply depots that should be empty are full, and most puzzling of all, there's some kind of massive convoy operation happening on a scale they've never seen. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, Chief of Staff of the German 5th Panzer Army, would later write in his memoirs, "We made our calculations based on conventional military logistics. We assumed the Americans would face the same limitations we did, the same limitations every army in history has faced. We were wrong." The Red Ball Express was achieving the impossible. Between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, they transported 412,193 tons of supplies, which is enough to fill 164,877 modern shipping containers. They did this with a 90% on-time delivery rate, which is better than most modern civilian shipping companies. But here's what really shocked the Germans. The operation wasn't even using the most experienced troops, it was running on damaged infrastructure, and it operated 24/7 despite air attacks and mechanical failures. German Field Marshal Walter Model reported to Berlin, "The American supply operation is unlike anything in military history. They're violating every principle of logistics, and yet it's working. We cannot count on their supply lines collapsing." This realization was devastating because the entire German defensive strategy in fall 1944 was based on the assumption that Allied forces would have to stop and consolidate their supply lines. Behind the statistics were individual acts of courage that never made the headlines. Corporal Charles Stevenson drove for 48 hours straight when his relief driver was killed by a strafing run, delivering critical ammunition to units that were completely surrounded. Private Jimmy Ruckerd's truck broke down in enemy territory, so he spent 3 hours repairing it in darkness while German patrols passed within 100 yards of his position. Staff Sergeant William E. Thomas organized a rescue mission when a convoy was ambushed, using their trucks to block German fire while evacuating wounded drivers. The racial dynamics of the operation created strange contradictions. These men faced discrimination at every turn when they returned to rear areas for rest, segregated sleeping quarters, separate mess halls, and constant reminders that they were considered second-class soldiers. But on the Red Ball route itself, a different culture emerged where rank and race mattered less than competence and courage, where white officers depended on black drivers for their survival, and where the shared danger created bonds that transcended the racism of the era. Lieutenant Thomas J. Edwards, a white officer commanding a predominantly black company, wrote home, "I've learned more about true equality on this highway than in my entire life. When shells are falling and trucks are burning, nobody cares about the color of the driver in front of them, only whether they'll make it through together." The Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944, when the port of Antwerp finally opened, providing a closer supply base for Allied forces, but its impact continued to reverberate. In those 83 days of operation, it had achieved what German generals said was impossible, what even Allied planners thought was a desperate gamble, and what would change military logistics forever. The numbers tell part of the story. 412,193 tons delivered, 6,000 trucks in operation, 23,000 personnel involved, 89,939,669 gallons of gasoline transported, and 0 days of operation halted due to enemy action. But the real impact goes deeper. Patton's Third Army continued its advance when it should have been stuck. The liberation of France happened months faster than German planners expected, and Hitler's hope for a stalemate in Western Europe evaporated. After the war, German generals would admit that the Red Ball Express was one of the key factors in Allied victory. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach stated in his debriefing, "We expected logistics to be the Allies' weakness. Instead, they turned it into their greatest strength." The Red Ball operation was brilliantly executed, and we had no equivalent capability. The military lessons were studied intensively. Modern militaries developed dedicated supply routes. The concept of just-in-time military logistics was born, and the importance of sustained 24/7 operations was recognized. But perhaps the most important legacy was human. The Red Ball Express proved that black soldiers could handle complex, dangerous operations with distinction, contributing to eventual military desegregation. Many Red Ball veterans would go on to participate in the civil rights movement. Today, if you drive through Normandy and follow the old highways toward Paris and beyond, you can still see remnants of the Red Ball route. Weathered signs in museums, memorial markers at rest stops, and small plaques in French villages remembering the convoys that rumbled through day and night. The story of the Red Ball Express is often overshadowed by tales of dramatic battles and famous generals, but it represents something equally important: the unglamorous, dangerous, exhausting work that actually wins wars. Those German generals who laughed in August 1944, confident that physics and mathematics would stop the Allied advance, learned a hard lesson: wars aren't just won by brilliant tactics and superior weapons, but by the determination of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions. The men of the Red Ball Express didn't charge enemy positions or fly fighter planes, but they did something just as crucial. They kept the war moving forward when everyone said it couldn't be done. They humiliated Hitler's generals not with bullets but with persistence and skill, and they proved that the supposedly impossible was just a challenge waiting for the right people to accept it. So the next time someone tells you something can't be done because the math doesn't work or because it's never been done before, remember those 6,000 trucks rolling through France in 1944, driven by men who weren't supposed to be heroes, accomplishing what the best military minds in Germany said was impossible, one delivery at a time until the war was won. That's the real story of the Red Ball Express. Not just a supply operation, but a testament to human determination, ingenuity, and courage in the face of impossible odds.